Okay, it is now 2:01, and we have waited exactly 2 minutes since the last announcement was made. But if you're just joining us, this is Jordan Frazek, reaching out with AppGeo or Applied Geographics, and we want to welcome everybody today, especially on GIS Day 2019, to the Regional Connections, Creating a Better Place to Live and Work webinar. And this is part of our MapGeo webinar series. So once again, thank you everybody for joining, and we'll get started right about now. So if you want to just go into, just first of all, everybody, I want you to go into your questions box in GoToWebinar, just some items of housekeeping. Throughout the course of this webinar, we encourage you to ask as many questions that come to your mind as you can. And at the end of the session, we will go through a Q&A session. So again, that questions box, it's a little bit small there on the GoToWebinar screen, but just pop that up and feel free, like I said, to ask as many questions as you can during the course of this webinar. So who are we at Applied Geographics? Well, once again, we want to welcome you here today for this webinar, and we thank you for accepting our invitation to join us. Applied Geographics, well, we have over 28 years of geospatial experience. Our flagship product is MapGeo, so you will see a little bit of MapGeo a little later on in this webinars. MapGeo is perfect for municipalities and counties, as well as regional entities, I should say. We have a number of regional entities using MapGeo right now, and this webinar really is centered around the connections that are being made in regions and how cities and towns relate to that. So if you're a city, if you're a town, if you're a county and you're joining us, we want this to feel just as relevant to you as it does to those regional entities that have also signed up for this webinar. So we provide a full suite of consulting and strategic planning services. Those are both big lines of our business, and strategic planning, if you don't know a lot about it, is something we definitely dig deep into. So feel free to ask me about that at the end of the presentation as well. We're big fans of open source technologies. Here at AppGeo, we don't limit ourselves to any one given set of technology. We are always looking for the newest, latest, best way that we can help ourselves and help our customers visualize their data and become better sort of spatial workshops. So we're going to go to the next slide here, and we're going to outline the agenda a little bit today. So if everybody wants to look, you can see the map of attendees on this webinar. So we are talking about this on a national scale, these regional connections. What we're going to do today is we're first going to start with the intro, then we'll dive a little bit deeper into improving the community and just a little bit of the theory behind regional connections. And we're going to analyze in this webinar our daily commuter flow. We have a very special guest with us on this webinar, McClure. He is from North Andover, Massachusetts. He is their IT director. And we're going to make an example of North Andover. And what we're going to do is we're going to relate all this great ACS data available and show you a few different projections and visualizations of how you can use it to better inform regional decision making. Next slide, please. So I just want to introduce somebody you may or may not know at this point. It's Waldo Tobler. And Waldo, being that we are a geography company, we're always thinking about this first law of geography, which is that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. I think even more so today, in the age of connectivity, this law is more relevant than ever. And we're going to dive into a little bit about how things that are near relate to one another, but how no town is an island. Really, everybody in this world nowadays is so connected. And if you would just go to the next slide, you may also know Waldo as Where's Waldo? So that was just a little sneak in there. So when it comes to improving the community, and this phrase that no city, town is left an island, that comes from Mary Babson Furer's book, A Crisis of Community. And so that is about the trials and transformation of a New England town. And so we paraphrase that, and we mention that no city is an island. So really thinking outside of just the downtown center or the core town that you're from, or likewise, if as a regional entity, sort of thinking about how to better relate to different cities and towns is what we'd like to focus on this webinar. So the flows between places, how connections are created, and how connections can lead to opportunities and shared values. So if we can just pop to the next slide as well. What I'd like to do now is introduce actually David Breeding from Applied Geographics. David is our Director of Analytics, and he's got a very good presentation lined up for you today. And this at a national level shows that some of the data that we were able to use to create this presentation, and we'll dive deeper into a local example.
Thanks a lot, Jordan. As the Director of Analytics here at AppGeo, often in this position of trying to distill a variety of data down to to answer a specific set of questions, or potentially flip that around and kind of ideate around how data can be used to answer a variety of questions. This map is showing commute flows nationally up to 160 kilometers, and kind of really is a picture of the connections that we're going to be kind of diving into, specifically this data set, and kind of look at what is apparent and maybe less so apparent. We're all kind of familiar with, that northeastern corridor and the connections that Boston, New York, and DC have in this, but there is other little connections which are interesting that once you drill in a little more, maybe there are some things that we're less familiar or less on the surface. And so we've dug in here and we've looked at this data more regionally and locally in the context of North Reading. We work a lot with transportation agencies, and I think we were exposed to this commute data in the process of analyzing broad, statewide trends, but we really, we were asked a few specific questions drilling in, and we're able to kind of we're surprised at some of the things that we were finding. So we kind of took that further and wanted to look at what was out in the research community and see if there were people already looking at these local trends, leveraging some of this commute data. And what we ended up finding was two researchers out of Dartmouth and Sheffield universities that had done just that. They had identified, this valuable ACS data and tried to reclassify what the nation might look like if you used these commutes as a proxy for how we organize and connect as societies and as communities. Some very interesting kind of, if you at the megaregions.us, you can go and kind of explore their nationwide map. But what was awesome about this resource is that they made all this data publicly available. And they also did the hard work of kind of processing all of these connections nationally. And that really was the bedrock for some of our exploration, because we really wanted to focus on just the freely available information. There's also paid for data out there that kind of also will show some of these transportation, these commute flows. We've worked closely with TomTom, and they have some really interesting data that you can kind of query to go down to the actual road network level. But we found this was a really valuable data set to start the investigation, narrow in on some of those questions, and then go to that more granular data set to kind of drill in even further. But let's talk a little bit more about the data itself before we get into the specific details and look at some of the trends and what it might be expressing. This data is coming from the 5-year ACS estimates, where they ask about where you're going to work every day and how you're traveling and how many people you're traveling with and the time it takes. So there's a lot of lots of good metadata and attribution associated with this information, but we are going to be working with it at the tract level, which is a unit of aggregation that allows for good comparisons. Unfortunately, at that level, it doesn't have transportation mode available, but it can, you can have that access at a county level. That's where that exists, but comparisons become more challenging. It's a little bit of background. This type of information has been collected since the 60s, but back in 2005 is when all of those questions were kind of put onto the American Community Survey product. And so, again, that's what we're working with. One side note is if you do work with this data, there is another census product called the loads data set, which is available at the block level, but it's much more, it doesn't have a lot of metadata associated with it, just merely the connections between blocks, and an account of travel. So, that can be also another way to go about exploring this information. So we took this data, this ACS data, and we did do some enrichment. We did kind of associate it with townships and other, and we did try to kind of provide more geographic context to each of the flows. But what you'll end up with, and in this example here, it's a lot of information. and you often can't glean, what's really going on. Right now we're looking at kind of the Merrimack Valley, and in the intra travel within those respective tracks that fall within these towns and cities. But when you start filtering the data, you can really start to pull out some nuance, and we start to see this bifurcation going on in that region, and where there's some really high, using the volume of travel as that filter, to see where they're kind of centered, or there's a lot of travel to and fro around the Lawrence area, as well as the Newburyport area. So, using filters, asking those, kind of reducing the volume of data is one way to kind of expose what's going on in kind of an exploratory analysis approach.
And David, if I could just cut in for 1 second, for those outside of Massachusetts or outside of New England who may not know, the Merrimack Valley is one of our major subregions here. And so North Andover is in the heart of the Merrimack Valley. We will dive into the town a little bit more and see how it relates to this area. But the area that you're seeing on the screen is the area surrounding the Merrimack River, on the border of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and it forms its own sort of sub-region with its own economy and its own movement within. So just for everybody that's not from New England to know where we're at right now.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, there's this type of analysis can be done, using that data for anywhere in the country, and kind of doing these filters. So this is just an example of one type of visualization, again, doing intra-flow within a community. But the other way to kind of really try to make sense of all of this data is to kind of really focus, focus in on one town and start there. As I noted, earlier, that's really some of the best ways to kind of identify trends, and then maybe look more broadly. Start with a town, see if you're seeing flow from a particular direction, as far as like a from the northeast or the south, and then, well, is that present in a lot of the different regions around my town, or am I special, and why is that? So by focusing in on a large data set, you can then kind of glean some trends, and then look more broadly to see if it's a unique or a common attribute kind of across the data set. We've worked closely with Chris McClure at North Andover for a number of years, and actually, over many years, not just when he was at North Andover as the IT director, but we do this type of support and exploration of data, and we've worked with Chris to kind of really develop some resources at North Andover, and it's just been a pleasure working with him, and we really want to kind of before we dive into some of the specific examples and we look more closely at North Andover, we want to get a little background about North Andover and what they're doing there, and how that kind of dovetails with some of the data that we're going to be presenting today.
Great. So this is Chris McClure with North Andover. Yeah, I've worked with Applied Geographics not only here, but I think in 3 or 4 different communities spanning back almost 15 years now. And I think it's interesting, looking at some of the themes at the beginning of this about sort of the interconnectedness of everything. GIS really is a metaphor for that. And I think the thing that really sorts of shines here is the fact that we've invested in GIS and invested in our relationship with Applied Geographics over these years. And some of these things have just sort of been, the happy accident of that investment. Taking a step back, for those of you who may not know about the Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts here, we certainly made the news about a year ago when we had the Columbia gas explosions for Lawrence, Andover, North Andover that we're still mitigating. And GIS has certainly played a role in understanding and dealing with the mitigation for that. But over the past 4 years with our relationship with Applied Geographics in North Andover, as you can see our online map tool here, I think we've taken the approach similar to the approach we've taken with other cloud resources. GIS isn't just a one-time investment; it's a continual investment in order to understand our community, the different connected departments in our community. And in kind of a funny way, even this webinar was sort of a happy accident where I was completely unaware of the work that David brought to my attention regarding some of this traffic analysis. But because of the pre-investment that we had made in our GIS and developing our layers and making the public aware of it, et cetera, it was really a breeze being able to take advantage of this and put it in a way that could be capitalized on. So I'll turn it back over to Dave for now. But
well, thanks, Chris, for kind of setting that up. And again, just to dovetail onto that, that happy accident, we needed a place to go focus on. We had worked broadly, we had aggregated large trends, but where were we going to focus, and what story did we want to go look at? And North Andover became an obvious kind of choice. And so we wanted to want to shift now. I want to go right to the MapGeo platform and start to show off some of these layers that we curated and talk a little bit about the data, talk a little bit about what questions they might answer, like they could answer, and just get into that that mode of hypothesizing and hopefully kind of maybe spark some ideas for how this data could support some of your efforts. So as I mentioned, we wanted to focus our attention on the commuters coming in and out of North Andover. Excuse me one sec. Start with the commuters out of North Andover. What we're seeing right here is kind of the extent, right? If we step back a little bit and see where people are leaving, where those large flows are. So if we see on the map, the red colored lines are a show of volume, and also that track to track kind of origin and destination. So all of these are currently kind of flowing out of North Andover. If we kind of switch to looking at where the commuters are flowing in, excuse me, that doesn't look like the right representation. One second, I'm just going to refresh quickly. Interesting. So actually, it looks like this representation is showing them flowing in from outside of the of North Andover, from New Hampshire into North Andover. Let me see if we got a switch here. Apologies about that. Let's just focus on, we can just keep it at a high level, but if we think about the flows in and out, are these flows originating in a particular location or ending in a particular location? How do those flows intersect? If we look closely here, would there be certain roadways that are going to be kind of leveraged more often than not? How does that kind of play into how we think about we should be adjusting the various control mechanisms that are controlling traffic to and flow? And what are those impacts of those flows? This is really good starting point just if we look at just the in and outs to kind of start hypothesizing where we might need to focus more, whether it's in the downtown area or potentially looking at where those commutes are flowing south and how that might impact North Andover. And I know that Chris has been kind of participating within the town, doing thinking about transportation studies, and maybe Chris, you could talk a little bit about some of that effort and what data you're kind of bringing together to think about those flows that are going on, or those impacts that might be needing to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, this proves, I think one of the challenges sometimes is understanding GIS and realizing the practical implication of it, and the real power of being able to understand and solve real world problems. And this was sort of timely in that North Andover, at our last town meeting, approved zoning changes to allow Amazon basically to build a pretty substantial fulfillment center, at the edge of North Andover. And the primary concern, really the only concern, residents at town meeting and in the social media discussion after that, is traffic. What's that going to do to commute? What's that going to do to traffic, et cetera? So certainly having this baseline of understanding what our commuter traffic looks like today, and then also being able to understand, changes that may occur as a result of this, I think will be extremely helpful in determining, setting policy or, other, road or traffic decisions going forward. It also fits into discussion the town's, having around master plan, around looking at priorities for sidewalks, around speed limits, around even, mass transit, et cetera. So, this is very timely to many projects ongoing in North Andover, and I think it really drives home the value of GIS and being able to understand spatial data, almost in real time here, as it pertains to goals and projects within the town.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that type of temporal nature of the data, how it can kind of bring, an additional lens to help support those efforts is what we're trying to do when we kind of expose some of these trends, and these are just example representations of what we can do. You can, maybe it's not the number of commuters, but it's the distance of travel, and so we can filter this view to kind of help answer whatever those questions may be. In that vein, just kind of jumping forward, we looking at connections between neighbors, more closely, and narrowing in on what is that relationship between Lawrence and North Andover? Where are those commuters coming from? Are there significant flows in one direction or the other? This is currently Lawrence to North Andover, but if you flip that around, this is from North Andover to Lawrence. And, at this level, it's kind of, where are people going? Where are they coming from? It's not exactly clear, but when we add another layer of data, as is kind of really, the power of GIS, when we start looking at those bus routes, and it kind of starts to make more sense on how people, where they're coming from, what modes they're leveraging to kind of move, between towns. And so we'll notice, some of that high flow coming from Lawrence to North Andover, down here by Mount Vernon Street. You could hypothesize that they might be navigating using the available bus routes. Is this something that maybe we can do an evaluation of how these these transit modes are supporting, or could be further enhanced? Maybe a better placement of a bus stop might further enrich the travel experience, or make for better flows to and from the neighboring community. Or is there an opportunity to think about walkability? If people are flowing to and from, how about that last kind of mile of transportation when they exit from, that bus stop? Is it conducive to walk in these areas? And so that, Chris mentioned a little bit about, sidewalks and that work that they're thinking about. I don't know if there's any more detail you want to add to some of that sidewalk analysis that you were kind of working on or thinking about in the near future.
Yeah, I think, the focus with sidewalks initially is safety, for pedestrians, obviously. And I think one of the interesting things when you talk about, the interconnecting data is one of the layers that we had already linked to our site was starting to analyze traffic accidents. So we can now start overlaying, that traffic accident data within the commuting data and see where the correlations are. And some of that may, help influence where the sidewalks go. But I think it's, sort of exciting as, we start looking at more regionalization too. If we are looking at, if there are common areas where people are looking at mass transit, et cetera, that, are there areas for additional stops, for additional resources, between those communities that might, alleviate some of that traffic, or, provide additional mass transit options. But safety has been the primary concern, and also understanding, everyone wants their neighborhood to have the lowest, to have their lowest speed limit possible, for safety. Is understanding, where it makes sense to do that, where sidewalks make sense, and, maybe some areas where it's not needed.
Thanks, Chris. And as Chris was talking, I did turn on that other layer of crash incidents which we pulled from the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. But this type of blending of information together, where you have your traffic flows and your transit lines, and that kind of mix creates paints a picture, and is just an example of how blending these and building up a repository can kind of create bring a lot of different disciplines together.
So this is Jordan. Just wanted to remind everybody, To please ask questions during this webinar, we do have the questions box that we will answer all questions for at the end of the session. And just a little recap. So far what we've done is we've looked at the traffic flows in and out of North Andover. We've identified the heaviest traffic flows coming from Lawrence, the neighboring city, and we focused in on how those flows relate to commuters. And we've done that by incorporating bus routes, and really this is a success story we're telling here. We're telling the story of flows that were identified, and through the McGovern and Buckley regional transit hubs, these bus lines service these heavy flows of traffic. Now, can we get better at this? Of course we can. As we see the heavy flows between South Lawrence and North Andover, we may be able to improve those bus lines or work with these regional entities to create a better experience for these commuters. But just to take it one step back, what we did was, at first, we analyzed the heavy flows. We zeroed in on them between Lawrence and North Andover, and now we're creating context in AppGeo using our themes by overlaying these bus routes with these heavy flows.
Thanks, Jordan. You know, there's lots of ways to layer data in MapGeo here. You know, we continued to kind of look this, we saw this earlier, but when we think about intrastate flows, you know, are there business opportunities that come along with kind of being in close proximity to a neighboring state? You know, what's the potential impact of kind of having these flows take place? In this particular instance, there's not a large percentage of volume flowing from New Hampshire, but, you know, more broadly, you know, there's many other places in the country where these type of cross-border relationships and these flows could be a valuable kind of a piece of the puzzle to look at and think about when kind of making, you know, planning decisions. And so this is just a representation of that given North Andover's proximity to New Hampshire. But, you know, in respect to kind of data enrichment, you know, one thing that we haven't shown, which I want to kind of highlight, is when you're using census related data, you know, when we have these flows coming, you know, in or leaving, coming to or leaving a tract, this kind of information about, you know, right now we're seeing, you know, household income, you know, are these flows originating in a place, you know, that has a certain demographic? How does that play when we think about our approach to solving these problems? You know, just, you know, are people already struggling to leverage mass transit because of their income levels in the Lawrence area? Or, you know, do we need to think about fare levels? But, you know, again, these flows in relationship with, you know, leveraging economic and demographic kind of variables, it creates another powerful image to kind of help understand what's going on when we think about these flows moving between various tracks and the composition of those. You know, so that data enrichment is something that should be considered when you're working with census data. And finally, you know, we kind of already alluded to it, but, you know, big kind of potential disruption that can come to a town is when, you know, new opportunities are available. Right now, excuse me, I've turned on a resource showing drive time, 5-minute drive time boundaries extending from where the actual Amazon distribution center will be, you know, will be coming to town. You know, when we think about where people are commuting, you know, in or out of North Andover, how does this kind of change in flow need to be, you know, thought about? Like, what will the impacts be? You know, where will these employees be living? You know, how will they be commuting? You know, having this type of representation, which is a really great resource out there called Open Route Service, and you can generate some of this data. You know, if you're doing lots of data generation, you definitely should kind of subscribe to their service. But you know, do some initial kind of investigation. It's a resource which is readily, you know, available for you to kind of play with. But you know, I was going to turn it over to you know, to Chris a little bit to kind of talk a little more about that Amazon's coming to North Andover. And I know you mentioned a little bit already, but where are you in the process when thinking about, you know, some of these inflows and how it might impact the town?
Yeah, so we're at the very beginning, you know, phases. So that's, you know, I think I was stressing that, you know, turns out to be a very timely study, and I think it speaks to, you know, the power of GIS, not, you know, just in sort of a backroom tool that It allows us to produce, maps that we can, on paper that we can show to people. But the fact that, here's something that is an active conversation, it's an active concern, that represents a political concern, for our constituents, to our decision makers. And it's something that, with this data that can empower us, to understand again where we are now and what things look like now. And also, as things start changing in the development process, which is going to take several years at this point, but, we can actually see, even the deltas as we study this. So it gives us a good baseline to understand and to present some, information that, allows us to communicate more effectively the primary concern for this project.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. Thanks for that context.
Absolutely.
One thing we've been showing off are just some examples of data that we've pre-filtered and kind of put in AppGeo. But just to give you some context to like the workflow that we we kind of often play with another resource called Cardo, and it kind of gives you some really interesting resources to do this filtering, to find that those interesting nuggets. And so right here, kind of this is a view to kind of interrogate some of the data that I wanted to show off just quickly to kind of give you a feel for a potential resource to help you once you have your data curated for your area. Right now we're looking at the commuters entering into North Andover. So from not really filtering on distance, but if you wanted to say, well, I'm really only interested in kind of looking at where are those long commutes from? What is the pull of North Andover, and kind of where are they coming from, and how many commuters are entering? This is a way to kind of quickly interrogate and get to the nuggets that you ultimately want to publish. And so we kind of played here quite a bit. I want to know how many commuters, like where are those large volumes of flow? And it seems like they're coming from a local point. They're not traveling as far, at least some of the largest flows of commuters entering into the town. But this is just a quick example to show some data investigation techniques and a tool that allows you to do this. We also do our work using Jupyter Notebooks, which is another more Python-based environment where you can kind of render things quickly. But this is a really accessible way for those that are comfortable using graphical user interfaces, and Cardo is a resource that can be leveraged to further enable this type of investigation. But I think at this point, we could dive, we could go and answer if there were questions that wanted to look at certain things, we could get into that. But I think in kind of wrapping this up, one of the things, when working with Chris and thinking about, how does this create value? How does this work in North Andover? One of the things that really stuck with me was, how this type of tooling, how this type of data can bring together diverse groups into a place where they can collaborate together and start really communication and conversation around it. We oftentimes have our own preconception about how things are and how they relate. And when you get data on a map, that can be a real powerful way to open and start conversations. And so, Chris, I don't know if you want to riff off of that, if there's any other things that you can add to, or an example maybe of, when you've had that type of collaborative type of communication in and around maybe some data or any topic for that matter around kind of the spatial kind of tools that you've deployed.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was going to point out too is, just from a resource and just expertise standpoint, I think one of the advantages, our model has been that GIS it's basically an ongoing operating investment, and but with the partnership with Applied Geographics, we basically pay an annual ongoing cost so that we get the tools, but we also get the resources and expertise of the firm, as opposed to and at a greatly reduced cost, the sort of the old-fashioned way of having a full-time GIS person on site here. And so I think it has the benefit of having a team who knows how to work these tools and understands GIS concepts in these tools. It's sort of this continued schedule You know, without one person here having to be an expertise in everything, but also it sort of frees up our team and our staff here to focus on the what GIS can do for us as opposed to supporting it. So it gets into that, you know, GIS really at its best tells a story, and it tells a story that you can't necessarily understand by looking at a spreadsheet, by taking that spatial data. So our focus has been entirely on, you know, integration, you know, to this point. So, and integrating everything to GIS. So at this point, working with Applied Geographics, we've integrated our document management system. We've integrated our permitting system in departments. We've integrated, obviously, our assessing system. We've integrated some of the public safety data. We've integrated from a public-facing standpoint, getting to this sort of model of where am I? You know, where does my trash day come? Where does my kid go to school, et cetera? You know, and getting into stuff like this, trying to make it a little easier for the layperson to understand. So a cool integration we've worked on, for example, is with another partner, we had our zoning bylaws codified. We're actually working on an integration with the AppGeo, the MapGeo product, so that you can actually see that abstracted based on where you live and sort of have the zoning bylaws broken down into sort of lay terms for people to understand. And again, sort of stressing the theme at the beginning, it's a sort of build it and they will come type mentality where, you know, we've got 4 years now of continued investment in GIS, in getting a product out that's available to the public, that's available to staff, that we've really pushed, that people understand, that we've continued to show value, you know, with new innovations and new, links over the years. And so again, when something like this comes out, there's a canvas for it to be displayed on. And a framework for it to be understood in, you know, whereas if, you know, David simply brought this data without the structure existing, I think it would be very difficult to do anything with it in a traditional GIS setting.
Thank you, Chris. And we do have a couple questions that have come in from the audience. I know that this is a topic that is broad and an area that may be unfamiliar to some folks. So just to be clear, we can definitely do this sort of analysis in other parts of the country and make this feel more at home to everybody. I do want to answer a few of these questions, and again, keep them coming. First question that we have is, what was the data that is presented solely from the ACS, i.e. free, or is there paid data that can be integrated into these graphics as well?
Thank you for that question. The data that you were looking at, and we'll just kind of cruise back up to, you know, this representation, these lines do stem wholly from the free, you know, ACS commute survey data. But we did do some enrichment, and we didn't use, it was all free data. We did enrichment, so wherever that track fell, we wanted to identify, well, what municipality was that in? So we were kind of appending to each of the respective start points and end points additional metadata about where it fell. So when you got into those visualizations, when you were looking, you know, and clicking at these various lines, you would have that data available to you, so you could kind of interrogate and say, oh, okay, you know, that's where they're coming from. So we, you know, in addition to using that data, we did do some more processing to kind of bring some of that information. You know, and there's multiple representations of it, right? You can just do those total so this is one tract kind of going to a single point, like all of those lines are radiating to this point. And so we did some summation as well. So really, like, aggregation and enrichment are the additional pieces that is what's allowing some of this visualization to kind of be delivered and filtered, is how I'd answer. But free, this is the free data. You know, in respect to paid data, you know, I mentioned TomTom. There's a lot of other, you know, data aggregators out there that are tracking vehicles all the time that have over roadway commute flows. But, you know, it gets really expensive when you start to look at this type of geographic extent. You know, to work with all of these points and with all of these lines and origins and destinations, you're getting to tens of thousands of dollars, and that, you know, that might not answer your question. So start here and then go to the paid kind of data when you really have a tight, narrow question.
Thank you, David. And I do see that we have a spatially inclined audience. We're going to pry into you a little bit right now. How do you account for the ACS margin of error?
That is a great question. You know, we can filter. You know, it depends on what we're trying to do. This work was pretty exploratory in nature, so we weren't kind of enforcing a kind of filter that would accommodate when in those geographic areas where you have small sample sizes and you have large error. You know, we weren't kind of making that pass or that judgment to kind of, you know, say, well, this isn't well qualified, or there's enough error in here that I think it might impact our analyses. So, you know, but that is something that should be considered. Anyone using census data should ultimately look at that error, and kind of obviously using the 5-year estimates is what we recommend, because that has the best, you know, volume of data, which can reduce those error, you know, error bars associated with this information. So yeah, this was kind of exploratory, and if we were to kind of do this for a client, we would also embellish and flag some of those parts of the data that maybe should be considered with a grain of salt, or kind of expose that you know, that error that's inherent in the data.
Thanks for asking that question as well. And we do have a few more, so I want to dive in. When you did your data analysis, did you look at travel distance or did you look at traffic volume? Did traffic volume play into anything?
So I apologize if I didn't kind of make this clearer. You know, in this representation right now, we have both factors. We have both travel distance and travel volume. So we've kind of used them in parallel. The thicker green lines or red lines in the other visualization indicated the volume, and obviously it's showing you a straight distance, but we have that calculated. So it kind of depended on which way we wanted to, you know, what question we might be trying to tackle. So having both pieces of data available, you know, allowed us to go from different directions. You know, if we were kind of focused on, you know, why are people traveling from so far, or where are they going? Like, you know, you saw the big, if we look at, you know, commuters leaving, you know, North Andover, you see this kind of bias south, but, you know, some of these really long distances are kind of curious for how far people are kind of leaving the area. So again, we have a lot of data at our disposal, and it's about the questions that we're trying to answer, and which factor is more valuable to try and assess or answer the particular question.
Thank you, David. And I think, yeah, anytime you're dealing with a really thick line of traffic and it goes really far away, that really does pique your interest. You want to know a lot about that commuter flow. Some may be obvious. I mean, North Andover is in proximity to Boston, so we are seeing that big thick line down to Boston. How can we better service those people? How can we make those train lines operate better? Are they working the way they should be working? Can we advocate for that? I think those are all questions that can be kind of extrapolated from this as well. We do have a few more questions. Hold on. Okay, just another question about how the screen was moving a little quickly. Again, that may have landed into why it wasn't readily apparent that the traffic volume was in play. There is a standard question here. Will the webinar be recorded? Yes, the webinar will be recorded. We will make sure to send that out to everybody. So if there's no other questions today, I think I'm going to wrap it up for us. Again, this is Jordan Frazek from Applied Geographics. I do encourage you to reach out to me if you'd like to know how we can get this data to work more closely to your town. And David, I think you have another closing message you wanted to get out.
Yeah, you know, I wanted to, you know, we're definitely as a service organization interested in kind of talking about the challenges that you may have in this arena. We're happy to kind of open that conversation and maybe give you some more details if we didn't get into them here today, to kind of, you know, answer or help you assess, you know, what this data could help you with, and where you want to focus. So we're happy to do that as well. And so feel free to reach out to Jordan, and he can connect you, and we can try to see whether or not, you know, we can find a relationship or find a project together to yeah, answer some questions that we might have raised today.
Must have deleted the question after they asked it. Okay. We'd like to thank everybody, and Chris especially, thank you so much for joining us from North Andover. This is truly, again, a success story that we wanted to tell, and we really appreciate that this data has been made into something usable. digestible, something that people are going to enjoy and digest and gain something from. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, everyone. Thanks for attending, and have a wonderful afternoon. And we hopefully will speak with you soon.